Hey YouTube, this is PokéCastXVll here, and this is just a one-off segment which I've labelled How to Build a Competitive Pokemon Deck. So I guess the reason why I really wanted to do this segment is because I know a lot of people have different misconceptions as to what a competitive deck is, and how the rulebook actually tells you to build one. So this discussion is mainly aimed towards some of the newer players who just need a foundation to build on, or potentially some of the other players who have been playing for a while but just need a better understanding of how to build a deck. So firstly, let's take a look at a couple of factors that you might want to consider when building a deck. This here is actually the new updated rulebook that came out with the black and white sets. So I've just brought up a couple of points which I thought were particularly important. So the first thing that I thought was worth mentioning, although this might be common knowledge to a lot of players, is on the first paragraph in the second sentence. It states that one of the most important rules is that your deck must be exactly 60 cards. It can't have any more or less, not even if it's just 59 or 61 cards. Secondly, the second paragraph states, also, except for basic energy cards, you can only have 4 cards with the same name in your deck. This means that you can only have 4 cards called Picknight in your deck, even if they have different attacks. Lastly, your deck must have at least one basic Pokemon in it. If you don't have a basic Pokemon in your deck, then there's no winnable condition. Lastly, the second bullet point states to make sure you have enough energy cards in your deck, and it states to try between 18 to 22 energy cards. Another frequently asked question is that, can you use cards from the previous sets such as the Diamonds and Pearl ones? And so the answer to this is no. Because we're in a current Heart Gold Soul Silver onwards format, this means that only cards from Heart Gold Soul Silver onwards are allowed to be used in competitive play such as tournaments. However, we are currently due to be going into a black and white onwards format next rotation. Putting this into context, it means that from the start of the 2013 season, we'll be expected to use cards only from the black and white sets and onwards. The last thing I wanted to bring up just before we get into the deck building is using cards from previous sets with the same name. Take for example Switch or Super Scoop Up. Because they both feature in a previous / current set, it means that it's perfectly usable for competitive play, however the text is errata to the current copy of that card. However, I would definitely advise you not to get this confused the other way around. Let's take a quick look at Pokemon Catcher, which was released only last year in Emerging Powers, and Gust of Wind, which featured in the base set way back in 1999. While they both have very similar text and do the exact same thing, Gust of Wind is actually unusable strictly because of the name difference. So let's move on to the deck. When deck building, there are 3 major factors that I always abide by, and in order they are: Number 1, the winning condition. How do you intend on winning? There are several different ways in which you could potentially win a game, whether that be in decking your opponent out, putting cards in the lost zone, or simply just taking 6 prizes off your opponent. And number 2 is synergy. Using cards that complement each other to gain a better advantage over your opponent. Take for example Darkrai EX, which is fighting weak, and pairing that with a colourless Pokemon such as Tornadus EX, which is not only splashable but counteracts the weakness of Darkrai. So this alone is just one example in itself. And finally, number 3 is consistency. How often does your deck play out the way that it's supposed to? Do the trainer or supporter cards help increase the chances of you getting the Pokemon and energy out that you need? Cards such as Dual Ball, Ultra Ball and Level Ball are all great ways of getting those Pokemon out you need to set up, whilst Random Receiver and Pokegear 3.0 will help you feed out those supporter cards. While the theme decks are great places to start deck building, they don't really offer many cards that are used in top tier decks, by the exception of energy cards and a couple of supporter cards as well. That is until the release of some of the more recent decks. The deck that particularly caught the eye of a lot of players before its initial release was a deck entitled Shadows, and that was because it included Zoroark in there. Pairing Zoroark with Weavile and Darkrai proved to be quite a formidable and disruptive force. However, with the rotation announced and losing Weavile, this really puts it back into perspective that it isn't all that great and will be put back into binders for another day. However, there are positives to take from the Shadows theme deck, mainly being that it includes a 3-2-1 evolution line of Empoleon, which is the deck that I'll be referring to in this discussion. I particularly quite like the concept of Empoleon, mainly because strategically it's relatively easy for any new player to begin playing with, whilst also still proving to be a serious contender in the Japan Black and White onwards format. Empoleon also doesn't need to run any EX Pokemon, however that can be adjusted when we receive the release of Mew EX, making this deck somewhat fairly cheapish to build. Moving on to the deck, I'll try and keep this as black and white onwards as possible with the rotation close to approaching. Starting with the Pokemon, it's really important that you include enough basic Pokemon whilst also taking into consideration the correct amount for each particular deck. With Empoleon being the main focus of this deck, we'll be looking to play at least 4 copies. Empoleon, for those of you who don't know, for a single water energy, does 10 damage for every Pokemon in play with a potential 120 damage. So let's start with the 4-1-4 lineup. Looking forward to the rotation, I would definitely advise playing the single Prinplup in there, otherwise a 4-0-4 lineup would have been more applicable. I'll be sure to touch on this in more detail once we get into the trainers and supporter cards. Subject to the deck that you're playing, you're usually wanting to play somewhere in the region of 6 to 10 basic Pokemon. While there's no set amount of basic Pokemon you should be playing, there are certain factors you should be taking into consideration. Probability is the key here. For example, and whilst it might be fairly obvious, having 4 copies of a single card will ensure the likelihood of drawing out that particular card. Working within your own resources and having 4 Empoleon will increase the probability of your deck running a lot more smoothly, as well as being on the offense. The temptation here might even be to start adding other water Pokemon to your deck. However, in doing so, you could be disrupting the consistency of the main focus of your deck, with that being an Empoleon. Similar to my example of Darkrai being fighting weak, Empoleon does have a lightning weakness. Unfortunately for Empoleon and other lightning weak Pokemon, the lightning element will always be a prominent factor whatever format you're playing in. Whilst you could play straight Empoleon, this then leaves you far too vulnerable. Your best options would be in the form of a Donphan Prime or Terrakion from Noble Victories. Let's go with 3 Terrakion as we're looking into black and white onwards. This will also be a great counter to the meta, with Retaliate hitting for a potential 180 on Darkrai, Zekrom and Raikou EX. It will also make a great bench sitter, increasing the attack of Empoleon's attack command. So as we come towards the end of the Pokemon section, let's quickly conclude deck building for Pokemon. When choosing Pokemon to use, always find Pokemon that create some form of synergy together, similar to what Empoleon and Terrakion do. Having several Pokemon of the same element with very few trainer cards, which is often something I see down at hobby leagues quite frequently, doesn't really have much of a strategy towards winning, other than attempting to create a large damage output. So what is the strategy behind Empoleon? Well, Empoleon's strategy is to gather as many Pokemon on both sides of the field to hit for heavy damage, with Terrakion being a secondary attacker as well as a counter. You should be averaging between 80 to 100 damage every turn with Empoleon. Moving on to trainer cards, this in my opinion is the most integral part of the deck. All trainer cards will have different benefits, so it's important to know what areas of the deck you'll need to be supporting. Searching out those basic Piplups will be your early priority in the game, so you should be looking at something like this to start yourself off. The level balls will be key to searching out those Piplups, with heavy ball searching out Terrakion. Your second priority will be hitting that turn 2 Empoleon, so 4 rare candy will be key here in my opinion. When I was first introduced into the game, I'd often read tournament reports where players would have a weird number in their evolution lineup, similar to how we're playing Prinplup. Because of rare candy, players look to completely bypass the first evolution in an attempt to attack quicker and use the abilities of their stage 2 Pokemon. In the Heart Gold Soul Silver format, with the use of Junkar making your discard pile quite flexible, it wasn't really necessary to have a Prinplup, as you'd always be in reach of a rare candy. Having the single Prinplup will offer some reassurance if you do find yourself having a bad day and not being able to draw out that rare candy, with Prinplup also being searchable. Here are the last of the trainer cards that I've included. Super Rod is a great card for recovery if you find your resources are becoming slightly thin, whereas Pokemon Catcher will allow you to take easy prizes as well as being disruptive. With Terrakion having an exceedingly heavy retreat cost, Switch will allow your deck to become a lot more versatile, should you ever find a Terrakion unwantingly in the active spot. I'll be sure to touch on the random receivers later on in the supporter section, however I do feel EXP share deserves a mention. EXP share will help maintain the energy flow between your Terrakion. Because Terrakion requires one colourless unit of energy, using EXP share to move the water energy off your knocked out Empoleon to Terrakion with the addition of a single fighting energy allows you to retaliate for 90 damage the following turn. Other additions you could include to the trainer section might be cards such as Ultra Ball, Max Potion, Enhanced Hammer, or anything else you feel might offer your deck more support. So let's move on to what I'd refer to as the consistency section of the deck. Supporter cards are designed to ensure that you're constantly accessing your resources. Here are the supporter cards I've included. A fairly standard lineup I'd say, with the addition of Empoleon's ability Dive and Draw, you should never be far off being able to draw into more cards. Whilst there's not too much to say about the supporter cards themselves, it is important to take into consideration what supporter cards you intend on using, especially with the inclusion of Random Receiver. Having a Random Receiver in hand will automatically guarantee you a form of drawing, if all the cards included are drawing supporter cards. Say for example you included a Silent, this in a sense could mess up your chance of drawing into something you might potentially need, if you were to top it with a Random Receiver. You could also include Bianca. Bianca tends to work well with Ultra Ball, however it is down to player preference. So on to the energy cards. Most competitive decks will usually only feature somewhere around 8 to 12 energy, with a few exceptions. Empoleon in itself only needs a single water energy to begin attacking, whereas EXP share will offer some form of synergy to ensure they maintain on the field in exchange to going into your discard pile. Super Rod is another key factor to a lot of players' low inclusion of energy cards, allowing you to recycle cards within your discard pile. In doing so and with your supporter cards, generally speaking you shouldn't have too much problem feeding out those energy cards to begin attacking. Special energy cards are another potential inclusion, with Prism becoming an obvious target when you're running two different elements of Pokémon. However, by including special energy then becomes targets for these two cards, Loss Remover, or in our case of Black and White onwards, Enhanced Hammer. With special energy looking to be increasing in play due to the blend energies compensating the new dragon element in the upcoming set, players will be looking to run a high count of several different energy cards, making them even more vulnerable than ever. While you're always at risk of a crushing hammer, at least it's on a coin flip, and having Super Rod will enable you to recycle those energies should they end up in the discard pile. As of yet, we don't have any ways of recycling special energy cards, meaning that once they go from the field or from your hand into the discard pile, that's where they'll be looking to remain. So as we're approaching the end, this last section that I've labelled conclusion is just where I wanted to go over a few things in relation to the deck and deck building. Remember, this is only the fine print or skeleton if you like. It's primarily down to every individual to find out what works best for themselves. I've purposely left gaps within the deck to which they can be filled accustomed to every player's preference. Let's take a brief look at my methodology from earlier for deck building. So number 1 was what was the winning condition. Well, the winning condition is to take 6 prizes using Empoleon, with Terrakion being a secondary attacker. Number 2 was synergy. With the use of EXP share and Terrakion having a colourless unit, the two share great synergy together, with Terrakion also compensating for the weakness of Empoleon. And lastly, my third one was consistency. Having a built-in draw engine with Empoleon and the use of random receivers, you should never be far off being able to draw more cards from your deck and into the resources that you need. With this in mind, using Rare Candy and a Ball Engine to search out your basics, I personally feel this deck is and can be very consistent. So I guess the final thing I wanted to say was doing some research on the format you're currently playing in will always be a plus. Posting deck lists on forum sites such as PokeBeach or PokeGym will always lead to some form of constructive advice. Remember, if a deck is top tier, there's probably a reason why that is. And so there you have it. Remember that Empoleon is just one example of a competitive deck that you can build. If you have any thoughts on this particular discussion or any questions regarding deck building generally, feel free to stick a comment in the comment section below and I'll be sure to try and get back to you. Hopefully this has been insightful and perhaps maybe cleared up a couple of factors that might have initially been confusing. Thanks for watching guys, and I will see you next time.